The Manitowish Waters Historical Society is proud to present Little Star Lake Railroad Legacies, presented by Jim Bokern. Special thanks go out to Jerry and Jim Wilkie, who helped support the filming of the videos inserted within the screencast. Little Star Lake Railroad Legacies really launches in about 1900 when a rail line comes from the Chicago Northwestern Railroad and makes its way across Powell Marsh. Ultimately, a large landing will be created where logs were lifted by a hoist onto railroad cars. The development of the Flambeau Lumber Company's efforts were so strong in the Star Lake Landing area, they created an office that we will visit along the shores of Little Star Lake. Ultimately, that same landing area will be used to transport tourists to many of the resorts in the Spider and Manitowish Lake areas. So we go to 1916 and we start to see on maps Star Lake beginning to appear. Usually, Manitowish Lake also included Star Lake in earlier maps of the area. And Star Lake being on the map was quite important because of its strong logging and railroad ties. When we look at logging in the North Woods, there is a three-phase system that scholars sometimes use of one, river or pine drive logging, two, hardwood railroad logging, and three, pulp and tractor logging. At the Rest Lake Dam, first the Mississippi River Logging Company and then later the Chippewa Lumber and Boom Company ran a big logging operation. The camp, as you can see in the background on the image to the right, is really located in the lower parking lot of the Pea Patch. As River Drive logging fades, there's a movement to use steamboats to move other logs, red pines, to railroad hoists. And so we get into phase 2 railroad logging that also uses the water. It's an interesting mix. So building the railroads becomes a challenge. They had new excavators that can build large grades and move earth. Moving dirt also on specialized cars assisted in creating these kind of pristine railroad grades that would go through the North Woods. These are exemplar images and not the images that were used necessarily for the construction of the line to Little Star Lake. We see the line from Powell went right through the Powell Marsh, as you see with the orange arrows here, ultimately ending at the landing where the blue arrow is. That was the main line, and swamps were prized because they were nice and flat. Two other secondary lines moved to the east. With the red arrows, this line went to Alder Lake, and the green arrows here followed down along Manitowish Lake. These areas were all prized for their lumber resources. If you look at the old tracks in the area, you can see going across the swamps, it wasn't as fancy as those earlier pictures with the steam shovel. Moving a lot of muck out of the swamps themselves, a grade was crudely manufactured, and with fluctuating water levels, the grades themselves were subject to sinking in the swamp and in need of repair. But these railroads were not meant for the long term, only to last long enough to take the lumber that remained in the forests. So phase 2 logging accessed red pines, hardwoods, and softwoods. And we'll witness this really launch in our area in 1889. And the image that you have here are hardwoods being removed. Hardwoods did not come to the Star Lake Landing. They were always red pine. The white pine were floated down the river at Rest Lake Dam all the way to the Chippewa Falls or even the Mississippi River. The steamboats then moved to the Star Lake area and would boom logs to this hoist right here. The railroad grade came from the Chicago Northwestern line in 1889 and went across the swamp. Harrigan's Camp is cited on two maps, and this is the main camp right in the isthmus, if you will, between the Stepping Stone Lakes and Star Lake. Powell, the small town at the end of Powell Road where the snowmobile trail crosses, is actually where the railroad tracks cross, and that's where many passengers were offloaded and then later moved to their resorts. Again, another image where the green arrow shows the logging rail line coming up, and again, Harrigan's Camp, which was part of the Flambeau Lumber Company operation. This began in about 1900. Again, using the paddle boats. This is the paddle boat that was used for both the White Pine River Drive logging and the Red Pine hoist logging. Taking a look at the hoist, this is the hoist on Little Star Lake. We'll look at it several times. It is one of the best photographs in Wisconsin showing this process. Notice a large white pine is cut in half here to create a raft-like effect, and the red pines are in this area. We'll look all at the hoist and the men and their operations in the next images. But the railroad cars are very clear, and this little bay you go by every time you go down Powell Road when you see Stepping Stone Lake on one side and Little Star on the other. So that is the red arrow, where one of the four hoists in Manitowish Waters existed. The Little Star Lake one in red is important. We'll also cover the Alder Lake hoist in this film. Not covered would be the Rice Creek hoist above Island Lake and the Riley hoist on Rest Lake. These were important and used quite often. In 1900, we see from the Buck family resort map that the railroad was well in place at Little Star Lake, and the Flambeau Lumber Company operated there on Little Star Lake from 1900 to when it's closed in 1914. The Little Star Landing, as I said, is really quite amazing. Notice with this bigger picture that they have a lot of pylons driven into the ground to hold the decking, and that they're moving these red pines, and you can see the bark on them that illustrates that they are red pines to this area. Red pines would not float long enough to get downriver like the white pines. As a matter of fact, many of the lakes in Manitowish Waters are still covered with red pines that sunk during this process before they could be loaded on railroad cars. Little Star Lake is notorious for big piles of these red pines because they couldn't load them fast enough, and many of these red pine logs sunk. Also, look at the long pike poles the men used to move the logs into the hoist area. This is the bracing for a large hoist that would then pick the logs up and bring them onto the railroad cars. We're now going to cut to the modern video of the location of the Star Lake Railroad hoist and see some of the surrounding area. Here on the west end of Little Star Lake, there is a large bay, and in the corner on the right, you see that little white pier. That is the location of the legendary Little Star Railroad hoist, where logs were hoisted onto railroad cars with the classic picture that we went over early in the presentation. As the drone gains elevation, we can see the airport, the area around the old logging office, and over to where Little Bohemia exists today. Thinking about logging in the Manitowish Waters area, there was a real sense of urgency around 1900 for multiple rail lines to push in to acquire much of the timber that was remaining. Part of this frenzy approach is evidenced in this Flambeau Lumber Company rail line and different cuts that they made. Swinging back to the Little Star Lake railroad hoist, we get a beautiful view of the Stepping Stone Lakes and of Powell Marsh. If you look at the grade going up Powell Marsh right here, you'll see that that is the old railroad grade going across to the rail line near Powell. Little Trout Lake is in the background, and between Little Trout Lake and where the drone is making this footage would first be the Alder Lake Spur, and then right at the base of the video would have been the Manitowish Railroad Spur. Coming back, be sure to look at that grade that is the old railroad spur that the DNR used in their development of Powell Marsh. We get a nice view of the Stepping Stone Lakes again, and it's good to think back of what it might have been when the trees were cut and how the forest has regenerated over time, providing us with a beautiful view of the North Woods. Please come and enjoy this view on your pontoon boat. And as you come into Little Star Lake, you'll go to the bay to your left. And when you go in the bay, you will see the Monroe property next to that lovely pier, that little bay to the right, where the logging hoist was about 120 years ago. Coming back again to the original picture, take a look at that historic image, and in your mind's eye, can you place all that activity in that tiny little bay and imagine acres and acres of red pines floating throughout Little Star Lake? So the development of the Flambeau Lumber Company operations expanded. The red arrow here illustrates the landing area we just reviewed. But then directly to the north, the yellow arrow illustrates the location of the office that was created to oversee these operations. Here's the building right here, and this was known, as you can see in the bottom, as Pancake Hollow. And one of the things we love for people to do in the Manitowish Waters area is to get out and explore local history. So we're going to help you see exactly where Pancake Hollow was, take you on a little drone tour to explain more about the office's location, and you can go in your pontoon boat and drive by and see this historic site. This cottage on the west side of Little Star Lake, right across from Little Bohemia, was the site of the Flambeau Lumber Company office. Now we're going to move up above that and take a drone view of the area, illustrating where some of these many logging railroad lines traveled. In the background, you can see Powell Marsh. As we pan more to the north, the line from Lac de Flambeau Lumber Company will proceed over the Powell Marsh and then come right between the Stepping Stone and Little Star Lakes. As we moved to the airport, there were actually two tracks of logging railroads that moved toward Benson Lake, accessing several different logging operations. As we pan back past the Powell Marsh and into the bay where most of the logging took place, right in front of us now, we move and look to the south and a bit to the east, and we see a slice of Manitowish Lake on the right side and the southern side of Little Star Lake. There is a railroad line to both Alder Lake and Manitowish Lake that comes from this Flambeau Lumber Company operation. It's pretty hard to believe that this logging camp's office is still right there on Little Star Lake for you to go by in your pontoon boat and think about things that were taking place between 1900 and 1914. It was interesting to see the building as it stands today in context to all the rail lines and areas around Little Star Lake. To delve in further to what we saw from the drone footage, this is a 1912 map, which is at the tail end of the logging operations by the Flambeau Lumber Company. But you still see remnants of the logging there from the Flambeau Lumber Company. All the orange arrows illustrate some plots of land in the areas where those spur lines went up to the Benson Lake region. Those were all being sold off after cutover to groups like F.I. Carpenter, which was a geology-based group, as well as the state, because State Forester E.M. Griffith was buying up cutover land to create a forest reserve in Wisconsin. The blue arrow shows a different camp, Brooks and Ross, that had another property there. Brooks and Ross would have to pay for every load of logs hauled by the Flambeau Lumber Company rail line, and that's how the Flambeau Lumber Company used their rail line to Little Star Lake to make even more profits. If we look at a modern map made by James P. Kaysen, we can see that there was both of those lines that tracked from Little Star Lake. This one went across today's airport, up to Marathon Road, and rejoined. In each case, they were making specific cuts, and they would be after the hardwood and some of the red pine. The white pine had already been harvested and been moved to the lakes and run downstream during that period. Here's a 1937 aerial map that was taken that shows those old rail lines, the ones arcing up across the airport and coming down to Benson Lake, and the ones that go straight off of Jerry Wilkie's property, off of the landing, up into the same region. Soon we're going to interject some other video from the ground to show you the railroad grades as they exist today. So these different lines that came from the logging camp here, Harrigan's camp, had interesting railroad grades. We'll look at the green marked point on Jerry Wilkie's property of that railroad and how it operated going to the areas we explored to the north of Little Star Lake and to the west. Showing the dugouts along either side of the old railroad grade. This was a typical standard where they would dig the earth out right here and pile it up and make an elevated railroad grade. We see this throughout the Manitowish Waters area. As we look a little further to the east, we see two other rail lines. One marked in blue, this is the Manitowish line that we'll be exploring, that came from the Harrigan camp. And just before that, there was another line that again went through those swamps that went all the way to Alder Lake on Alder Park Road by the campsites where many people enjoy the beach there today. We're going to see that these lines are going to be created in a much cruder fashion without the same kind of deep trenches and excavations. It appears that simply shovels were used to create this line. Here to the right, you can witness the arrows that show from a 1937 map the route right out here to the beaches on Alder Lake. We'll be exploring this red dot right here, and I'll show you this barely visible railroad grade that's out there on property owned by the Department of Natural Resources. It's important to note that the DNR and the DNR archaeologists were both informed when we did this review of the railroad tracks, following all laws and policies from the state of Wisconsin. Here's the railroad grade with excavated holes there and there for fill to build the grade up. In the mucky areas, you can see the railroad grade here with the excavation holes dug deeply, covered by water, to build up the grade. through this rather damp, swampy area. Next, we're going to interject some drone footage from a pontoon boat located about right here on Manitowish Lake, where the blue arrow is. And we're going to review both the Manitowish line from above the treetops and elements here of the Alder Lake line. This video is looking south-southwest on Manitowish Lake. As we pan up the lake, this is the route where both the Manitowish Lake Spur Line and Alder Spur Lake Line came from the Flambeau Lumber Company encampment on Little Star Lake. Going past Powell Marsh, these lines ran parallel, both the Alder and Manitowish line. If you would be looking back 120 years ago, you might see smoke coming up through the trees from the train. The Manitowish rail line terminated about here, close to shore, while the Alder Lake line extended further. You can see Alder Lake in the background, just above the tree line of Little Manitowish. It's certainly interesting to be able to see footage from the lake view up over the treetops to kind of give the contextualization of what it must have been like for early pioneers to see the big forest come down and then the railroads coming in and moving those logs out to market. And also, many pioneers talk about how they could see long distances after the cutover and see the smoke coming from the trains that used both these tertiary routes and secondary routes, all that create the hub at Little Star Lake. We're going to transition now from the logging portion of the Little Star Lake landing to the tourist portion, where wagons and stagecoaches came from the town of Powell versus riding the slow-moving logging train to get to the landing. Some tourists did take the train, and Michael Dunn mocked the speed of the train, saying that folks could actually fish off the side of the train in the ditches as they would try to move their way to Little Star Lake because it was so slow. But the landing was developed to support those leaving Powell, Wisconsin at the Powell Railroad Station and following Powell Road today to get to the landing site. First, the railroads supported early wilderness adventure seekers. By 1890, many hopped on the first railroads and wanted to get their canoes in the water and go out and hunt and fish in these largely untouched regions of Wisconsin. In the upper right, you see a picture of a camp on Manitowish Lake. Tent camps were used exclusively at this time, and really only a few lodges existed for folks to go to. We actually have podcasts on the Manitowish Waters Historical Society YouTube and podcast channels that can be found here on our website, where you can hear these stories and see some of these images of the early adventurers. But it wasn't long before advertising took hold, and Rand McNally talked about ads of how to get to Manitowish Waters, talking about all of the great fishing and opportunities and wonderful lakes. If you look at the bottom, they say you can take a Pullman car every day from Chicago to either the Manitowish or Mercer Station. But savvy travelers found a quicker and arguably better way to get to Manitowish Waters by using the Powell Lake Station to get on those wagons and shorten their route. So if we take a look at the rail lines going from Woodruff, Flambeau, before you get to Manitowish and Mercer, the yellow arrow shows Powell, Wisconsin. And here again is another example of the depot at Powell, Wisconsin, servicing both Manitowish Waters, and certainly Springstead and Sherman, Wisconsin. What people don't understand is that the wagon trips from Manitowish were 7.25 miles when you would get in your buckboard and get ridden down to one of the landings where you'd be picked up by a launch. But from Powell, Wisconsin to Little Star, it was only 5.6 miles. And you're going to get off the train earlier, and that's going to speed your time up to your desired resort and destination. So the launches start off on their journey. The one on the lower left is a prized image the Manitowish Waters Historical Society has right at Buck's property. The writing in that image, Spider Lake Resort, that's where the Highway 51 bridge is today. And you can see the launch steaming out to get folks who are at the landing. On the right, you see a picture of the Little Star Landing. There are many pictures in the collections of personal postcards and the early resorts because landings, departures, arrivals, all were photographic opportunities. The one on the right is, I think, the best of the landing. You see the effects of the cutover and the trees that are knocked down with only a few small ones remaining in the back. The folks to the left are on the launches, ready to take people out. And notice the number of buckboards that are here. We have 1, 2, 3, maybe 4 buckboards that I see in this picture. So we both have land livery and launch livery of folks going to these resorts. And this is driving the economy of the Manitowish Waters area. Where they were headed from Little Star Lake, again, another nice example of a postcard image of a boatload of folks coming in to get back on their buckboards, to make their way to Powell, to go on the train to their destination, likely down around Chicago or Milwaukee. But they're going to be coming from launches just like this with large decking areas on Spider Lake. Here at Voss, as you can see, again, their launch with a classic view off of their docks, showing exactly the kind of resort culture that was being developed in Manitowish Waters and being prized by tourists from all over the United States. Deer Park Lodge was involved in this as well, and you see here 2 images of the landing. And you can see Deer Park Lodge right on the bow of this launch with, again, another buckboard and a whole group of visitors taking off going down Little Star Lake. Well, this bay is no longer filled with red pines. There's some neat development on the peninsula to the north of this bay, and you can see the effects of the cutover there today as well. So the launches mainly went to these destinations: Voss's, Deer Park Lodge, Buck's Resort, later Kerner's Resort. Let's take a moment and look at some drone footage that shows us the modern view of this area. We'd like to give you some context of where these historic lodges once were. You're looking at Deer Park Lodge, now Chippewa Retreat. In the background would be Voss's Birchwood Lodge, still in operation, and to the left would be Kerner's or Buck's, and currently the Blue Bayou proudly serves food on the same site. Now, looking back at these historic images, it gives us a more informed view of what it was like over 100 years ago, getting to Manitowish Waters and enjoying fantastic summer activities. But it wasn't only resorts that used the landing at Little Star Lake. There were also other developments by those who wanted freight moved in. In early images from the 1900s by the Flancher family on Manitowish Lake, they used Montgomery Ward to order portable houses and cabins that came up on the rail line to the Little Star Lake landing and had locals assemble them. These were actually kits that people could purchase to make their own recreational destinations. just another usage of the Little Star Lake landing that added to the early culture and architecture of the Manitowish Waters area. Well, we hope you enjoyed this review of Little Star Lake Railroad Legacies. And we want to say again a special thanks to Jim Wilkie and Jerry Wilkie, who is driving the boat and supporting the drone footage that you see embedded within this presentation. Jim was masterful in handling his drone and was fighting some rather stiff winds to bring us the footage that we enjoyed. It is also important to note that Jerry Wilkie had contacted the Manitowish Waters Airport and all aviation authorities to make sure the drone use was authorized and respected all safety protocols. We hope you enjoyed this, and please get out and explore all the exciting elements of the historic and cultural past of Manitowish Waters.